A guy from Tinder drove to see me without asking. I'm a 20-year-old female. I connected with a guy named Phil on Tinder a while ago. He seemed interesting, so I gave him my Snapchat. We chatted briefly, but the conversation fizzled out quickly. I didn't disclose the exact town I lived in. Instead, I mentioned a larger city about 10 minutes away, assuming he wouldn't be able to locate me with just that information. A few weeks ago, Phil reached out to me again, and we engaged in small talk. Everything appeared normal until New Year's Eve. The day before, he messaged me, mentioning that he would be in the area and asked if I'd like to meet for lunch. I responded that I would consider it and let him know. On the following night, I hosted a New Year's Eve party with a small group of friends. I was occupied with getting ready and didn't check my phone until around 7:30 p.m. To my surprise, I discovered multiple messages and missed calls from Phil on Snapchat. I promptly replied, apologizing for the delay in responding. Within minutes, he opened my message and completely overreacted. He said something along the lines of, "Just so you know, I'm really not interested in someone who can't even answer the phone when I drove 6 hours just to see her." I was taken aback, momentarily thinking he might be joking. I responded by asking him what he meant and clarifying that he didn't drive 6 hours solely to see me. He insisted that we had plans and questioned why else he would have made the lengthy trip. I was bewildered because we never made any plans. I assumed his visits was work related or to see a friend, since it's not uncommon for people to travel to that area for business. I explained this to him, emphasizing that we had never arranged to meet and I hadn't asked him to come all that way for me. He claimed he had waited for me for 2 hours and even bought me flowers. Again, I was confused because we never agreed on a specific time or place to meet, nor did we confirm any plans. You don't make arrangements simply by informing someone that you'll be in the vicinity. I apologized once more, reiterating that we never had plans. In response, he demanded that I make it up to him by driving up to see him the next day. Well, that was definitely out of the question. At that moment, I remembered that I had shared my location on Snapchat, making it possible for him to track me down. I swiftly disabled location sharing, but kept him on Snapchat just in case he attempted to find my house. Fortunately, I haven't heard from him since. Tinder date that turned weird. I once went on Tinder date when I had just moved to a new city. Since I didn't know many people there, I decided to explore the dating scene through online apps. I connected with a girl who seemed like an artsy, free-spirited type. After a few exchanges on Tinder, we agreed to meet up for a drink. I picked her up from her house, and she greeted me with a hug at the door. She mentioned a local bar where she wanted to go chat and get to know each other. I offered to drive and headed towards my car. That's when I noticed the first red flag. She followed me to the driver's side and stood behind me, staring. After a blank stare for about 15 seconds, I asked her if she was getting in the car. She replied, "Sure, I'd love to," and took the longer route around the back to reach the passenger side. I thought she might have been under the influence or something, since she gave off a stoner vibe. During the drive to the bar, she spoke in an unusually low voice, almost as if she were whispering. Despite having no hearing difficulties, I had to ask her to repeat herself several times to understand her fully. Once we arrived at the bar, I made sure we got a seat away from the crowd, closer to the back in order to hear her better. From this point on, our conversation flowed normally, and we actually had a good time. We discussed our interests, and she mentioned her recreational use of weed and other psychedelic substances like mushrooms. While these weren't my cup of tea, it did help me rationalize her eccentric behavior as a possible result of being high on marijuana. However, I had also had a few drinks by this point, which impaired my judgment. I invited her back to my place after drinks, and she agreed. Once we got there, we had a few more drinks, and that's when things took a strange turn. She started talking about her jewelry, and this is where it got really bizarre. She claimed that her jewelry held a significant secret that defined her. When I asked her why it was so important, she said, "I'm actually Anastasia, and I wasn't killed in Russia." My jewelry connects me to my past. At that point, heavily intoxicated as I was, it was hard for me to take her seriously. I somewhat challenged her statement based on my limited knowledge of history. This triggered an intense reaction from her. She began yelling at the top of her lungs about my lack of respect for ancestors and history. Then, she quietly approached me, grabbed me by the neck, and forced our faces close together while still holding onto my neck. She declared, "I am a shaman and I will curse you. My ancestors have punished many people and you will suffer for not respecting them." Afterward, she dipped her hand into a glass of whiskey, made a cross on my face, and kissed my forehead. At that moment, I started to sober up a bit. I managed to calm her down by convincing her that I was only joking. Slowly, she returned to a more normal state, but then she began discussing her cat fetish. She informed me that she had a list of people whom she tamed to act like cats. While I didn't want to judge her based on her fetishes, I listened to her talk and observed that she started acting like a cat in my living room. If it weren't for her previous outbursts, I might have found it somewhat intriguing. Nevertheless, my eternal warning signals were going off like crazy, so I simply listened and tried not to provoke her. She noticed a sage bundle on my kitchen counter and asked if she could light it to bless the house. As a side note, I occasionally use sage to freshen up my place, and it was a personal ritual I preferred to perform myself. I told her she couldn't light it and explained that it was something I liked to do on my own. That's when she erupted, calling me a terrible person and screaming uncontrollably. I offered to drive her home immediately, and she rushed to the door and stepped outside. While she screamed at the top of her lungs, calling me a horrible person who should die, I informed her that she could find her own way home. I then returned to my place, locked the door, and hoped that would be the end of it. However, after about 10 minutes, she started banging on the door, claiming that she had left her phone inside. Reluctantly, I retrieved her phone from the kitchen counter and opened the door to give it to her, but as I did, she attempted to barge inside, and I used my forearm to block her. She even seemed poised to punch me. I stood my ground and firmly refused to let her in. She demanded the whiskey bottle we had been drinking from, but I categorically denied her request since I paid for it. I slammed the door shut and locked it. For a minute, she continued to bang on the door, but eventually her footsteps faded away as she descended the stairs. I waited about an hour before venturing outside to see if she was still lingering around, but I didn't find her. In fact, I never saw her again after that night. I found a cop on Tinder. A few years back, I was using a dating site and came across a police officer's profile. Initially, I was drawn to his cute dog and saw it as an opportunity to finally interact with a canine police dog. However, my interest quickly waned as he began complaining about his recent divorce. Although I don't recall the specifics, it became evident that he was the problematic one in that relationship. Moreover, I felt uncomfortable with how he fetishized me based on my physical attributes like my big sloppers, aka my breasts, tattoos, and colorful hair. I decided to be upfront and expressed my lack of interest, explaining that his behavior raised some red flags for me. Despite my clear rejection, he persisted, begging for a chance. Nevertheless, I firmly declined and blocked his number. A few days later, there was a knock on my door around midnight, which startled me immensely. Peering through the peephole, I saw a stranger holding food. It turned out to be an Uber Eats delivery driver. I informed him through the door that I hadn't placed any food order, but he claimed someone else had ordered it and knew my name. I asked who placed the order, and the name mentioned was unfamiliar to me. Reluctantly, I told him I didn't want the food and directed him to dispose of it in the nearby dumpster, as I couldn't be certain if he was genuinely from Uber. Later, while reviewing my dating app matches, it dawned on me that the names associated with the food delivery was the same as the police officers. I unblocked him to monitor his messages, keeping an eye on any concerning content that might pose a threat to my safety, in case I needed to take precautionary measures or consider purchasing bear mace for self-defense against a police officer. A few weeks later, I was at work, attending to my clients as a hairstylist when I received a call from an unfamiliar number number. Assuming it was a new client, I answered. The voice on the other end stated, "Hey Becky, I'm at Starbucks across the street. What's your drink order?" Confused, I asked for the person's identity since I didn't have their appointment in my book. Assuming it was a regular client and I had made a scheduling mistake, to my dismay, he revealed his name, causing my heart to sink. How did he know where I worked? I confronted him, demanding to know how he discovered my workplace and home address. He explained that he conducted a reverse image search on photos from my dating profile, which led him to my social media accounts and my salon's Yelp page, from where he obtained my address. Alarmed, I warned him that I would report his stalking behavior to his police station, and emphasized that any further contact or approach towards me would be considered a threat, prompting me to take necessary physical self-defense measures. Despite my stern message, he still pleaded for another chance. Disgusted, I ended the call, immediately contacting the police station where he worked to file a complaint. However, to my disappointment, they showed little concern, refusing to accept email screenshots of the creepy texts. The response I received was disheartening, with one lady even remarking, "Oh, I'm sorry, he's going through a lot right now," treated as if he's the victim. Following that incident, he mostly left me alone, but the experience left me terrified, especially since I was living alone for the first time in my life.